Hey, last time I was talking about power and authority, um, and I'm kind of jumping topics a lot, but one thing I forgot to mention in that was some of the books I'm reading right now, which are not really intended as philosophy books, but they end up being philosophy books, is T.H. White's The Once and Future King series, which is his take on the Arthurian mythos, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Merlin and so forth. And one of the great things he does is, it's what the Disney movie, The Sword and the Stone, is based on. And, it's based on T.H. White's incarnation. And he relates everything to what's going on in World War II and stuff. So that's really interesting. Merlin is supposedly teaching Arthur natural history, but really what he's teaching him is ethics. He's trying to teach him to distinguish between claims of might and claims of right. In other words, to distinguish between power and authority. And so Arthur comes up with the idea that might should only be used in the service of right. Or in other words, power should be used in the service of authority, not against authority. When I say authority, I don't mean government. I mean that which deserves to be obeyed. Sometimes government does not have authority, it only has power. Alright, so I hope I made that clear. I think it might be a good idea to do something I should have done probably pretty early on, and that is talk about the branches of philosophy. And the list changes almost every time you name them. But the basic branches of philosophy are ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, and there's one that I'm forgetting. There always is. There's always one there's always a few that you forget. You never seem to remember them all. Let's see: ethics, metaphysics, aesthetics, epistemology, and slipped my mind. Well, I'm going to go through and explain what each of them is. Oh, well, I guess philosophical anthropology might count. Sort of a combination between metaphysics and ethics. Well, I guess you could say any of the subjects is a combination of the other subjects in some ways. Except I think ethics really stands pretty much on its own in terms of being a distinct subject. Anyway, let's see, whenever you try to talk about this, you always go off on all these different tangents, and so I have to be really careful and stick to the subject. The branches of philosophy and defining each one of them. Well, ethics is the one that I am most interested in studying. It's the most practical branch of philosophy, and it's where most of the payoff comes out. Most of the practical application of philosophy is found in ethics, and ethics is about figuring out what people ought to do, how people ought to behave, not how people actually do behave. How people actually do behave is covered by philosophical anthropology and by the related science of psychology, if psychology can be described as a science, which is something that is debatable. But ethics is not about what we actually do, it's what we ought to do, right? What we should do, whether we actually do it or not. Okay? Oh, metaethics is another branch of philosophy I had to cover. Metaethics is really the study of what we mean when we say ethics. Metaethics is sort of the debate between absolutism and relativism isn't really an ethical debate. It's a meta-ethical debate. You can really only have an ethical debate between absolutists, between people who believe that there is a real right and wrong. Only then is there something to argue about. So there's ethics. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, of knowing. In other words, how do you really know anything, right? That's epistemology. What is knowledge, and how do you find it? A lot of talk about epistemology has to do with methods. Logic is an important branch of philosophy. You might say it's a branch of epistemology, or you might say that epistemology is a branch of logic. You might say that philosophy itself is a branch of logic. I mean, how they relate to each other is going to vary from philosopher to philosopher. Anyway, so we talked about ethics, we talked about epistemology, metaphysics, which is one of the hardest to understand what it is. So, because it's the study of what it is. Metaphysics is sort of the question of whether there is anything beyond physics, right? Physics is like atoms and gravity and stuff moving around, how the different molecules bump into each other. That's physics. Metaphysics is the question of whether there is anything beyond physics. For instance, physics really only studies what things do, right? Physics says, that we define different objects in physics only by how they interact with other objects. But metaphysics asks the question, what is the thing in itself, right? Most of metaphysics is concerned with the question of ontology, or whenever I use the word ontology or ontological, that means what the thing is in itself. The question of anthropology, which is the study of man, is a metaphysical study because it's the study of what man is. Right? So the study of what something is, not just how it interacts, but what it actually is, what its nature is, what its essence is, what it is necessarily and universally, what it is fundamentally, that's the question of metaphysics or ontology. But there are other metaphysical questions, well, related metaphysical questions like, what is the universe? What is everything? And the debate between naturalism and supernaturalism is a debate over metaphysics, right? Metaphysics is the subject of the debate. What is? Is there a supernatural or not? That is the question between the naturalist and the supernaturalist. And that is a metaphysical question. Okay, so we talked about ethics, we talked about epistemology, we talked about metaphysics. Aesthetics is the study of what is beautiful. Like, aesthetics is not something I've studied particularly much. A lot of aesthetics is very subjective, but it's still part of philosophy because of the type of question it is. Even though I think in many cases, I think there's a range of things that have the potential to be beautiful. And then within that range, which ones do you prefer is totally subjective. That's my opinion on aesthetics. But there are all kinds of opinions on aesthetics. But I think most of them agree that on some level or other, that aesthetics is mostly subjective. While most theories on ethics claim that ethics is objective, most theories on aesthetics admit that aesthetics is subjective. And by the way, the objective-subjective distinction is something in epistemology. It's objective if it's outside of you, right? If it doesn't depend on you or your thoughts about it. It's subjective if it's within you, within your mind, right? If it's totally dependent on your own thoughts about it, and it changes if your thoughts about it changes. That's the objective-subjective distinction. At least I hope I phrased it pretty good. Now let's see, what other areas of philosophy have we not covered? I talked about anthropology, the study of man, is about how do humans interact with each other. Let's see, talked about, I think that's most of them. I'm sure there's probably some big giant area that I'm leaving out. And I mean, different people rank these different things differently. So, like I said, different philosophers will give different lists of the branches of philosophy. Some will leave aesthetics out. Some will put logic in instead of making logic part of epistemology. Oh, logic. Should have defined logic. Logic is simply the rules that govern truth. That's my definition of logic. It's very simple. If you say it's true, then you're saying, part of what you're saying is that it conforms to the rules of logic. Logic is a set of rules, not a set of beliefs, right? Logic is a method, not itself a substantive thing, right? Mr. Spock will often say something like, logic dictates that. No, it doesn't. Logic doesn't dictate that. The premises of your argument dictate that, right? Logic itself cannot dictate anything. It can dictate that some things are not, but it doesn't positively dictate anything. So logic is sort of a quick sort of debunking tool in many cases, you know. If it's illogical, it cannot be true. Okay, so I think that about covers the branches of philosophy. I hope I've done okay. I guess I'll probably have to redo it at some point if it's not good enough. Well, I'll see you next time.